Welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. My name is Rebecca Markert, and I'm the legal director for the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Today our topic is titled, A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing, How Religious Proselytizers Invade Public Schools. We will be discussing tactics used by adults to infiltrate public schools and push religion on young school children. We will address some recent examples and legal protections that parents and students have under the First Amendment. As always, if you have any questions, be sure to post them on our Facebook page or send them to askanatheist@ffrf.org. Joining me today to discuss and answer your questions are two FFRF attorneys, Patrick Elliott and Chris Line. Welcome.
Happy to be here.
So this is an issue that is pretty near and dear to my heart now because my oldest child is in the public schools now. And in fact, this morning I got an email from the principal that said this person was coming in to do yo-yo tricks for the children. And I thought, well, who is this person? Why is he there? And I did extensive research, and it turns out he is really just good at yo-yo. But there are people, evangelicals, who go into the schools. Patrick, why don't you tell me why they go into these schools?
Well, you're right. We see this. I don't think it was crazy for you to look into this further, because we see that they'll use any means possible to try to get into schools. And basically that's because, one, they want access to young children. We've seen that from some evangelical groups like the Gideons, which there's a certain age that they think people are, fixed in their ways, which is probably accurate from, a sociology kind of perspective. But they want access to children. And children are compelled by law to be at public schools, or to be at school. So that's where they get that direct access, and also, they're impressionable. So really, this is a place where all these people are gathered that are impressionable and are, I guess, ripe for the picking in the eyes of some evangelists.
Right, and so they're going there to find souls for Jesus.
Right, pretty much, and we see that in just some of the materials that people write about in their interactions at schools, is it is like a numbers game for them. They'll count, in their mind, the number of souls saved. So it is something that is, the top of their list, is reaching these children where they're unchurched. So because it's a public school, it's not like going to, the church and saying, oh, we really have to, have a good Sunday school program for these kids. They're trying to reach other people's children. This isn't about their own children. Right.
And we had that example a couple of years ago when I handled a complaint out of Tennessee where this guy who goes by the name of Bible Man went into the schools and did a weekly, Bible study with young elementary school students. And there, we got him out of the schools, but there was a community backlash. And one of the reasons was because this Bible Man study that happened once a week was sometimes the only time these kids got access to the Bible and were exposed to God. So that is reaching the unchurched is a goal and an aim of theirs. So you and I have been here a very long time, almost 10 years for both of us. So we've seen this manifest itself in a lot of different ways. How did they come into the schools, and what kind of services do they provide for these public schools?
Right. I mean, and Chris is becoming, now seeing this, but there's the same playbook. Really, the goal is to get in with any justification. So the title, A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing, is really accurate here. Sometimes that's under the guise of doing a mentorship program. We see groups coming in at lunch, visiting with students or saying that they're monitoring, the lunch period. But the big one where this tactic is used is school assemblies. And so we see a group that claims to be an expert or secular expert in some field, whether it's bullying, sometimes there's suicide prevention, substance abuse, all these different topics that public schools rightly might be interested in having some kind of programming. The problem is these people don't actually have expertise or training in these areas. They're evangelists, and they know how to get into the school, which is to claim to be an expert at whatever program it is. They put on an assembly in school. Oftentimes that coincides with them distributing like cards and leaflets to kids, including either thinly veiled religious programming or outright religious programming in some cases. And then the big thing is inviting kids to come back with some kind of a teaser. So saying, again, some of these groups are pretty absurd. A lot of the strongman groups who do feats of strength, and then they say, come back tonight to really see a good performance, is really what they say. We've seen some videos of this, and then the evening performance is full on, religious, come find Jesus, altar call, but it's just bizarre because we'll see it with the strongman groups, skateboarders, there's an artist who does really fast paintings. I mean, it's everything under the sun, and they come touting, some kind of secular message along with this talent, and then really try to, snowball that into some evangelical means. Right,
and what is interesting is that when I first started at FFRF, I knew that I was going to deal with religion in the schools, and I knew that I was going to deal with prayer, teachers praying with their students, coaches praying with their students. I didn't realize that religious assemblies would be an issue area that we would encounter, and it really is kind of interesting because they do come in and do some sort of secular assembly and then invite them later. And I remember Dan and Annie Laurie telling me there are these pizza evangelizers out there, and I didn't know what that was, and they said, well, they hold an assembly and then invite everybody back for like a pizza party that night, and it really is this altar call that you're talking about. But sometimes they don't, hide themselves. They're not the sheep's in wolf's clothing, they're just the wolf. And one of those instances was with this rapper, B-Shock. We have a video from 2011 when he entered a South Carolina school.
We're here in the gym at New Heights Middle School. This is Jefferson, South Carolina. 6th, 7th, 8th graders tomorrow are getting a B-Shock show, plus Christian Chapman. I'm so thankful for Bridging the Gap Ministries because they're the ones that are putting all this together and making it happen. Because of this, people in public schools are going to get to know who Jesus Christ is, and that's what I'm excited about. Let's go.
This relationship with Christ will keep you face to face with God with integrity and say, Lord, I love your son, Jesus.
So that's pretty obvious that it was problematic. They were proselytizing to young children during the school day. Chris, can you tell me why that's problematic?
Well, it's problematic because, as Patrick had alluded to earlier, the kids have to be at school. And a lot of these assemblies are mandatory. It's not like, oh, if you want to go to this, not that that would make it okay anyway, but the students are there at school and then suddenly they say, okay, for the rest of the afternoon, we're going to go watch this rapper, that we saw there, or other proselytizing groups. And the students have to be there. And so this is a captive audience. Parents usually don't know that this is going on, or if they do know that something's going on, they don't know the full extent of it. So they don't really get a chance to say, hey, I don't want my kid to see this, because they don't even know what the kid's going to see.
Right. Right. And B-Shock in particular, he went online and boasted about bringing, 342 students to Christ at that particular assembly or throughout the year, something like that. And we wrote a letter of complaint to the school district, as did many other organizations, and that school district got sued. Do you want to talk about that lawsuit a little bit?
Right. Well, ultimately, this was such an absurd situation where they were sued in, U.S. District Court in South Carolina. The school district ultimately had to give in. There was no good legal defense for putting on that type of programming at a public school. And so it ended up, the plaintiff had an agreement with the school district that a judge entered as an order where they weren't going to allow these types of events to happen. They weren't going to allow prayer within schools, and a number of other violations that had been going on in the same school district. And ultimately, the school district had to pay not only their own defense costs, but pay the attorney's fees for the plaintiff. And so, the end result was finally this isn't going to be allowed in school, but it shouldn't have taken, a lawsuit and all this in terms of time and expense. It shouldn't have taken that to know you can't bring in a Christian rapper like this, into a public school. And we laugh a little bit about the performance, but obviously the parent should have been very upset about that type of performance at her at her child's school.
Right, and they were pretty obvious on what they wanted to do in that school, talking about how they are going out to evangelize. But it's not always that blatant. And when we do have these assemblies where they are the strongmen and they're just up there ripping phone books and showing feats of strength and then inviting them back later, how do you address something like that when presumably what they're doing in the school is okay? They're talking about drugs and alcohol, they're talking about bullying, they're just putting on an entertaining performance. How does FFRF handle those types of complaints?
Right, well, one, we need to know what the group is, and usually it doesn't take too much effort to figure out what their purpose and mission is. And so, we often gather information from the parents, who sometimes don't have full information because it's their child's at school during the middle of the day. And we, bring this information to the school districts, pointing out to them, you can't bring in, just because an outside speaker is presenting the message, doesn't make it's okay for you to, have people invited back for a religious worship service later in the day, or to hand out religious materials during the performance, or to include, religious elements to the performance. So I think we've done a pretty good job in terms of informing the schools that we have, but right now, we don't really know all the places that these groups are going. We know that they're traveling the country and putting these performances on. So right now it's a little bit of reactive rather than something that we could hopefully do, and superintendents should do their due diligence to make sure their principals and their schools aren't bringing these types of groups in.
And so in the past, we've been pretty reactive, like you mentioned. We find out about these assemblies and we write a letter and hope that in the future it won't happen. But Chris, you've been working pretty hard the last couple of weeks on being proactive in this area. And you have been working on an assembly that's put on by the Todd Becker Foundation. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so like he said, a lot of these groups, we don't know where they're going to be or things like that. Well, the Todd Becker Foundation, which is a religious ministry that goes around and puts on programming that then leads to religious discussion with students, they keep a map on their website that shows everywhere they've been. So last week, Patrick and I sent 350 letters to 350 school districts that they've been to before, letting them know that they shouldn't come back, that we want this group out of public schools. We have a video clip that'll show you show you what the Todd Becker Foundation's about through Keith Becker, its leader's own words.
Hi, I'm Keith Becker of the Todd Becker Foundation. Several years ago, my brother Todd was tragically killed in an alcohol-related car accident. Leaning over my 18-year-old brother's casket, I saw firsthand the seriousness and the consequences of a life that was lived in rebellion to God's Word. But it was at that point in my life that I realized my desperate need for Jesus Christ. And as I came to know Christ, I began to see that my brother's story, it could be used to reach lives with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And from that, the Todd Becker Foundation was born. It was born as a ministry to reach public high schools with the life-changing gospel. What was once a hopeless tragedy, God has transformed into a powerful assembly that brings His Word into public schools. And nearly 7 years later, over 200 high schools have been reached, and nearly 50,000 students have been touched in the bleachers and gym floors of public high schools across the Midwest. Week after week, we've carried the message of the cross into these schools. Lives have been changed, broken hearts made new, and hundreds upon hundreds have come to Jesus Christ. But as you know, reaching public schools with God's Word is an effort that many oppose, and that's why today I'm asking for your help. Statistics show that nearly 70% of all commitments to Christ come before the age of 18. After that, the odds are against them that they'll ever come to Christ. Our culture isn't helping either. Every day, youth are led astray by the deception that comes from MTV, Budweiser, and the likes of our rebellious culture. Making things worse, fewer and fewer high school youth are active in church than ever before. That means fewer and fewer youth are exposed to the truth. Now more than ever, we must reach them before 18. The battle for their souls is raging every day, and we need your help. We need your help to take the truth to them, right where they will spend the majority of their life before 18, their public school.
So, I mean, they weren't really hiding what they were intending to do.
Right, that's the thing that you can tell from the video. They don't hide it at all. They are a Christian ministry. They admit that. They have interns who travel around with them, working on their Christian ministry, reading the Bible, working on what Bible verses they're going to share with students, stuff like that. Unabashedly evangelistic Christians. They want to spread, Jesus Christ to students. That's their entire mission.
So what do they do when they're in the schools? What is the assembly about?
So the assembly, as you kind of saw there, it starts out talking about Todd Becker, who died, I think, 12 years ago. His brother then became a Christian after he died, and started giving this talk where he explains, sort of what led to Todd Becker's death. He uses a Bible verse to do this. I think it's Matthew 13:17 or something like that. That basically talks about like a narrow and a wide path. The wide path being the bad path, and the narrow path being sort of Christianity. And so he basically tells kids, the basic things that Christians tend to support: don't have sex until you're married, anti-pornography, anti-drinking, stuff like that. So it starts off fairly, appropriate for school. Kids shouldn't be drinking while they're in high school. They shouldn't be drinking and driving. These things are dangerous. It starts out with that sort of thing. It uses this tragedy to highlight that, but it just slowly more and more kind of tries to pull them towards a religious message. It kind of starts out pretty broad in general, and then it leads to a religious to become more directly religious. So it starts off kind of as almost soft religion. Like he's not going to say, come to Jesus, you have to believe in God. He's not actually explicitly proselytizing during the daytime assembly, but it's kind of a soft push. It's a lot of the things that Christians believe being pushed in the assembly, and then he uses that assembly he will then have people come forward and identify those who his group can talk to one-on-one, and they'll have these one-on-one talks where they use the Bible and scripture to talk with them. They'll kind of comfort them. I mean, the assembly can be pretty emotional. I mean, when you hear about people dying, about making wrong decisions, and I think the two questions to focus on we've seen from their material is, where is your life going and where will you go when you die? That second question being very religious. I don't think there's a secular way to talk about where you're going when you die, but that's what they discuss with these people. So these kids are worked up. They're very emotional. They then say, hey, if you have problems in your life, if you want to talk about things with us, come forward and talk to us. When they come forward and do that, that's when they start the process. And that's when they bring it to God. And I think we have a video clip of Keith explaining how they use the daytime assembly to morph into these one-on-one conversations.
We talk about how, as Matthew 7:13, we do quote it on our big screen during the assembly. It says that there's two roads in life. One road is that narrow road. The other road is the wide road. And we talk about how choice after choice after choice, my brother sadly chose that wide road. And so during the assembly, we're really paving the picture with students to get them to realize, man, one step off that narrow road is just as dangerous as 15 off. Because our culture, and frankly the devil, wants to say, hey, a little bit's fine, a little step's okay. And that's how my brother got sucked into sin so deeply and was killed. And so students, as they're listening to this story, they're really examining their life and going, wow, I don't want to end up like Todd. I have way too much potential. I have way too much to lose. And so at the end of the assembly, which is really how we get the gospel into public schools, although during the public assembly we're sharing scriptures, what we don't do during that public assembly is say, hey, you need to come to Jesus Christ, come forward right now and give your life to Christ. At the end of the assembly, though, we will give a challenge or an invitation to the student body. Will say, if you know that you're not on the right path, we're challenging you right now as our band plays this last song to get up, to come forward and stand on this narrow road. Now, sounds like an altar call, but it isn't. We don't mention come to Jesus. We say get your life on the narrow road. And that's where we see literally dozens, from 100 students to 5 students, that will come forward, stand on that narrow path. Well, that is how we identify who God might be working on.
Yeah, so as you can see there, he explains that, they ask these kids to come forward to the narrow path. They do what is typically in a Christian thing. If he was talking about Christianity, that'd be an altar call. They're playing music, and they're saying, come forward if you want to be on the narrow path and live a good life. They then realize who these kids are who came forward, And these are the kids that, through their materials, it appears, they then target afterwards. So both the foundation members, band members, they bring in people from local churches. So before they get to these schools, they get volunteers from the local churches. These people see those kids come down to take the narrow path. They go up and talk to them. They say, hey, you came down here, do you want to learn about Jesus? Like, where are you going when you die? Are you a Christian? Let me share some scripture with you. That's the worst part of this. I mean, the assemblies, like I said, they try to somehow toe the line, but this is where it really crosses the line and is violating the Constitution.
Do these assemblies happen only in high schools, or are they also happening in middle schools and elementary schools?
These ones I think are high school. I think the Todd Becker Foundation is only doing in high schools. They are, like I said, trying to pick out they cause a sort of emotional stir in people and see which kids might come forward. And then once those kids have come forward that clearly want to talk to somebody, they have something going on in their life, whether it's abuse, problems with alcohol, drugs, all the sort of things he brings up in his talk, they then get to talk to these people. But the people that they're talking to are not expert. These aren't people trained to work with children. They're the Todd Becker Foundation members, the band members, they're local pastors. They're people who are there to evangelize. That's their goal. That's why they're there. They're not there to, help a child who's being abused. They're there to win converts to their religion.
I mean, it's just besides the legal issue, one thing that I was struck when we looked into, some of the materials that they're putting out, because one of the things they do is say, oh, you can, submit anonymous questions and we'll answer those. And from just some of those responses, you can see it's not, the focus is purely religious. And so I guess why I'd be disturbed is this is a group giving kids an opportunity to talk about, substance abuse within their family. I mean, there are questions that they've been submitted saying, I'm being, beat up at home. And their response is often, oh, well, talk to somebody else about that, but let me tell you about Jesus. I mean, that's what their response is. So really, there's an opportunity missed here if it was a licensed therapist or somebody else who's trained and also presumably has some laws that apply about whether they have to mandatorily report certain types of abuse to public authorities to stop the abuse. Here, it seems that that's not going on because they're getting handed religion, not getting handed actual, secular resolution of what their problems in their home life might be.
Yep, that's important to remember. These are evangelical people. They want to spread religion. I mean, this is very obvious. People they've been affiliated with. Kirk Cameron was a speaker at one of their banquets, I think last year. And people like that, people in the evangelical Christian movement are the type of people supporting the Todd Becker Foundation that are speaking at their events, that are donating money to them, that are supporting this group. So like I said, the main thing we're targeting in this is those one-on-one conversations where they're having these discussions with kids. And I think we have a clip where Keith Becker's kind of explaining why they believe this is legal, and we can address that after we see that.
And it's 100% legal, it's 100% constitutional, it's 100% appropriate because it is a student's free will choice. Frankly, we could talk to them about bingo if we wanted to. We could talk to them about Sports Illustrated. We could talk to them about anything because it's a one-on-one conversation. The school has nothing to do with it. It is outside of school hours because typically the assembly is at the last period of school, so school's dismissed. So when people ask and go, how in the world do you do that? The bottom line is we do it one by one, a student's choice to talk with us. And we've had so many different organizations scrutinize it, look at it, really go, is this appropriate? In the 12 years we've been doing this, Dave, and we continue to go in and win souls one by one.
Mm-hmm. And you said
it's really unsettling to see that, especially as a parent, that there's somebody out there that is really targeting your children and trying to get them one by one to come to Jesus, or just have some sort of really deep conversation with them about something that should be had with, parents or their friends or somebody else who they know.
The problem here is you can see he doesn't understand how the school connection works. Right. He's saying, oh, it's, sure they came to us because of the school program, but now that the school days ended, even though they're still here, our conversations are somehow not attached to the school at all, which is ridiculous. He says, oh, we could talk about Chess or Sports Illustrated or whatever. I mean, no, like if you're getting access to these kids because they let you into the school is responsible for whatever message you give to the kids. They can't claim, right, well, they came in and talked about this, and then the school day ended, and then they stayed and talked about something inappropriate. Who cares? That the children chose to stay is not, it's not legally supported through case law, and it's not, and I think just in general, anyone who thinks about it realizes this is not, if you, as you said, you have kids in school, if you found out that someone was let into the school to put on a program, and then after the school day ended, they stuck around and talked with your kids about something inappropriate, your reaction wouldn't be, oh, well, at least it wasn't involving the school. It was this group.
Right.
It's just a ridiculous concept.
Right. It raises a lot of red flags, I think, for parents. And I do think that there is an obligation on the superintendents and the principals, people who are inviting these people, to do their due diligence and find out what their real purpose is in coming and talking to the schools.
Right.
Just from a legal matter, it's interesting to hear why they think this is okay. And we're being attorneys familiar with the case law, I would never tell a superintendent it's okay because the conversation is one-on-one. In fact, that's more coercive.
Right.
And the courts have recognized that when they've looked at Gideon Bible distributions, and they've said, well, when the Gideons come into a classroom and try to distribute Bibles, there's a coercive element to that. This interaction with another person is very coercive, and you can see that obviously in the images that they've shown where the Todd Becker volunteers are having this very intimate moment with students. That's not okay just because a school teacher's not doing it. The school can't bring you in and allow you to do that, regardless of if it happens 1 minute after the bell rings or as other students are leaving. It's not okay. It's not going to pass. I'm very confident it wouldn't pass any court's eyes if they were to look at it, which I think there's going to be an opportunity at some point for courts to rule on it, and that would obviously be struck down still.
So now when this happens, they mentioned in the video this is usually the last hour of the day, and then the school bell rings and the school day is over. So this one-on-one conversation, it's still happening in the school, on school property?
Yep. So we've seen they're very, very public about this. Pictures on their website. We showed some of them earlier, pictures on their Facebook of them, in the bleachers, on the gym floor, just huddled around kids, putting their arms around kids and reading them the Bible, stuff like that. This is happening on school property. The only reason they're claiming that this is, not a part of the school day is that for some reason they're setting up the assembly so that it's at the end of the day, so that they can claim that once the assembly's over, that's the end of the school day. But as we've explained before, and as cases have explained, that's not the end of the school day. Children have to be given a chance to leave before, something after school can occur. Like in some cases, the Good News Club, for example, is allowed to rent schools after school. And even in those cases, we would say they can't be there immediately as the school day ends while students are still trying to leave. They can't start proselytizing the students who are there because of the school day. They can't use that as a means of getting to children, which is clearly what's happening here.
Right, and in the situation of these Good News Clubs, most of those are happening at elementary schools, and so the bell rings, and then the teacher lines them up and then takes them to Good News Club. And these young children who are, 6, 7, 8 years old, they have no idea that this is not a school-sponsored activity anymore. What would be the difference then in high school?
Right. I mean, I think here, they certainly seem to think that the bell is the ending. Aha, now we're okay. We would say that's not the case. Students are still at school, subject to discipline. Teachers are often still paid to be there. Students are engaged in after-school activities. It seems that in some of these assemblies, it's not even at the end of the school day in some cases. So I don't think it really is significant at all, the time of day that it takes place, if the school is putting on the program as a school assembly. Yeah. So since that's the case, I don't think there's really any difference between that and any other activity that would be going on in school, which to some extent is different than some outside rental that might take place, at a later time where students would come back to school on their own or with their parents. That may be a different scenario, but here this is still part of school programming.
Right. So you guys wrote a bunch of letters to superintendents across the country. Can you tell me a little bit about what you did to address this situation?
Yeah, so we sent a report to 350 school districts. As far as we know, that's all the school districts that have already put on an assembly. Now, they either hosted it or they participated. In some cases, groups of schools bused to a certain school that actually hosted it, but the other high schools sent their kids to watch it. We sent this report hoping to shine light on it so that people know, people are aware that this is illegal, that what's going on, and that, hopefully we can get them out of schools. Now, we're not the first group to do that. The ACLU has been involved. Our friends at Americans United have written about this in different states. And the Todd Becker Foundation, Keith Becker specifically, is well aware of our efforts to get him out of public schools.
Yeah, he mentioned it in the video.
Yeah, he mentioned it. We do have another clip too,
Okay.
where he's going to explain sort of a us versus them in public schools.
But the bottom line is we have listened too long to the voices of anti-Christian groups like the ACLU. And the problem is, a lawyer, actually one of a very prominent state official in one of the states told me, he said, Keith, you got to remember, the ACLU has an agenda just like you have an agenda. Make no mistake about it. And he sent this out to public schools. He said, do not forget, groups like the ACLU and the Freedom from Religion, they have an agenda just like the Todd Becker Foundation does. And they're right. We have an agenda. We want to win people to Christ. So you're going to have to judge. Do you want your anti-Christian group's agenda in your school? Or do you want a group who wants your students to graduate, to stay off drugs, to save sex for marriage? Do you want that group in your school, or do you want the anti-Christian group? And the bottom line is both have an agenda.
Well, as you can see there, him explaining sort of that it's either the ACLU and groups like us that want to keep this religion out of school in your schools, or his group in your schools. Of course, that's not true. That's a false dichotomy. We don't want a religious group like that in schools, and the difference being we're trying to protect the separation of church and state by keeping religion out of schools. He's going into schools, directly talking to students and trying to bring religion into schools. It's not the same thing.
No, I mean, our agenda is to uphold constitutional principles and protect our democracy.
Right.
And his agenda really is violating the law.
Yep. And the same thing with the ACLU, they protect civil liberty. I mean, right. He's right on that. We have different agendas, but we're using our agenda outside of schools to try to keep people like him out. He wants to bring his agenda, which is to proselytize, to take kids to Jesus, into school. He then, of course, makes this other alludes to the fact that we're just an anti-Christian group, and that they want to see kids graduate and stay off of drugs and things, which is just a strange way to explain it, particularly when, it's clear that their main motivation isn't those things, that their main motivation is, bringing kids to Jesus and winning converts in the schools.
Well, this expose is huge, and we've sent the letter out. Have you gotten any responses so far?
We've gotten a few responses from superintendents. I guess it was interesting to see. Some people, I guess the benefit of the project seems some superintendents weren't fully aware of this was going on in some of their schools. And so when they called us, we could say, actually, they were last there in 2016, and it was at this school. So that was helpful to have. So we really were prepared for these questions from superintendents saying, I don't know what you're talking about. We also know that the Todd Becker Foundation has targeted some of the same schools again, and so that's something that we've mentioned, at least when I've received phone calls from superintendents about this, that this is something they need to pay attention to, because the Todd Becker Foundation is going to try to come back. They revisit some of the schools that they've previously visited, and so it's merely been a matter of days. So this is just the initial response we've received. I imagine we'll receive some letters in writing from superintendents either agreeing that they're not going to come back or maybe not responding if they are planning anything, but certainly a liability for them if they're going to continue with any programming like this. They could be challenged in court.
Right. And we know that they're in a school today, aren't they?
Yep. They're in, I think it's Broken Bow High School in Nebraska. We wrote to them yesterday a second letter. So we sent them, they were a part of the initial batch of 350 letters. That was the general warning. But I found out yesterday that they'd be having an assembly today. So I wrote them a letter specifically saying, this is a liability. You need to cancel this program.
Yeah. So what states are they in?
So they're in sort of the Midwestern area plus a couple other states. So basically from Minnesota to Texas. It's mainly out of Nebraska. That's where the group is from. That's where they do their most. of their assemblies, but they also do, like South Dakota is a big one. They hit a couple in Colorado, just a couple in Texas.
Kansas is big as well.
Kansas is another big one. So they're centered in the sort of in the Midwest there, and they drive out to these different schools, as they say in some of their materials, 20, 25 weeks a semester. So they're just on the road, I think, doing at least one of these a week in different areas.
Right. And we've been focusing a lot this latter half of the show on the Todd Becker Foundation, but as we mentioned earlier, there are many groups like this across the country. You had mentioned, I think, the Strongman Team Impact, Sports World, things like that. They're really all over and trying to get into public schools. I want to go to questions because we're getting a lot on Facebook. So the first question I'm going to direct to Patrick because it's from Minnesota. This comes from Jezebel Pride. Do you know about the Compass Group in Minnesota teaching Christian teachers how to approach students legally?
So I'm from Minnesota. I'm also licensed in Minnesota, but we weren't familiar with this group. We did look at their, in receiving this question on Facebook, did look up their materials, and as expected, you'll see some blurring of truth and fiction, where saying, oh, it's okay for teachers to have their faith or to do certain activities, but it's basically about getting, Christians are learning that they don't need to check their faith at public school doors, is one of the quotes that they have. But what they say, along with some things that might be permissible, would also be to say, take opportunities when you can, make your faith known. So they're kind of telling teachers to do certain things. They're telling them, you should participate and see you at the poll and bring your Bible to school day. And as we know, no, school teachers cannot do this. They can be disciplined by their school. Their school could be sued. Those activities are supposed to be student activities. Students can bring their Bible to school or do a see you at the poll prayer event. Public school teachers cannot. So this Compass Group was news to me. Thankfully, we're not getting a lot of complaints out of Minnesota about teachers doing some of these activities, but that may change depending on, if teachers are going to take that what I would say is bad advice about what they're told is legal, but in reality is not legal.
Right. It really seems that they're not understanding what their official role is within the school, and then that they can't participate in the religious activities of the students, and that those activities really do need to be student-led and student-initiated. So Edwin Daniels asks a really good question, and one that we often get. What if a student can opt out of the assembly? Is it okay if it's only voluntary?
Well, I guess I'll take it, Chris. I guess what's favorable for this is we have guidance on this. Courts have addressed this question. This goes back to 1948, McCollum versus Board of Education. The student there didn't have to take religious classes. He was sitting in the hallway. He could go somewhere else. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that was unconstitutional. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that prayers at graduation are unconstitutional, even though the graduation is voluntary. They ruled that prayers at high school football games are unconstitutional, even though that is voluntary. And then we have a number of circuit courts that have said the same thing, saying, well, you can't opt in to religious programming or force somebody to opt out and make themselves conspicuous and saying, well, you don't get to go to the school assembly today because your school decided to bring a religious group in. So that, thankfully, I think we have a lot of guidance from the courts that this voluntariness is not a real justification, although it's one we see all the time, is people think, I've just come up with the greatest argument ever, people cannot do this. And the reality is, in every Establishment Clause case, people are able to opt out. It's just the alternative is I don't get to be a part of school program, and that's the problem.
Right. It really puts the children in a bad position. Suddenly they feel very excluded and alienated, especially if they're really young. We've had superintendents say, okay, well, we have a religious song that we're going to sing, and we understand that you're atheist parents and you don't want your child to sing that, so we'll just have them step off stage while we sing this song and then they can come back. And we see that as an excuse all the time. You also see that now with the Pledge of Allegiance and the National Anthem arguments. Another question specifically for Chris, it says, question for Chris by Martin H. Do some principals know exactly what they're inviting to the school, and do they wink and encourage it?
I think that some of them do. I think some don't. I think that some, really do, sort of buy the message that they get when they hear about this group before they let them in it, that this is just going to be sort of an event to sort of help your kids make better decisions. But I do think a lot of them do know, particularly the ones who've had to come back multiple times, likely know that, this is going to be sort of lightly religious, and that it's going to be a religious message, but it's close enough to the line that we can get away with it, and can hopefully nobody will question us bringing in this religious group because their message is watered down enough that we're not afraid, or that we can pretend that we didn't know. But I do think a lot of them are aware are winking and saying, hey, we know that this is a religious message, but that's a message we want to give to our kids. That sort of thing.
We've had cases where, they were somehow related to the person who puts on the assembly, or, they found out about the people who put on the assemblies because they saw them at their church or something like that. So sometimes they are really knowingly bringing them in and know what their exact purpose is.
And that's something the Todd Becker Foundation does. They actually, for every assembly, have a comment either from a student or from the principal, sort of endorsing it and saying, this was a great presentation, you need to bring this into your school. Essentially every school has one of these on their website. So they're then using that. In fact, one of their questions on their FAQ says, is this appropriate in public schools? And their answer is essentially, look at all these endorsements from principals. Would the principals be telling you to bring us in if it was religious and inappropriate?
Right.
Well, we know the answer to that.
Right. And if the principal or the superintendent, whoever's in charge of bringing the assembly in, they outright state that that's detrimental for them too, because it is evidencing a religious purpose, and that they can't do that. They can't bring people in to proselytize children. This one's a bit of a longer question, so bear with me here. It says, Dan asks, so what can we do as parents to ensure this nonsense isn't going on in our children's schools? We don't always know what happens while they're there, and kids don't always talk about what happens during their day. Can we send some sort of letter to the faculty reminding them that this is a violation, and would that make a difference?
I think I like that. I like that this is, a kind of a proactive approach. Obviously, that's something we want to do because we find out about it. Typically, the student comes home, tells the parent contacts us, and at that point, these guys are on to another school. So I think it's something interesting for parents to bring up, maybe at the level of a school principal, is to just say, hey, I know that there's groups out there that do this. Are there any planned assemblies this year from outside groups, that kind of thing? Because then they'll know. Sometimes schools will send home a permission slip, which to me means they know they're doing something they're not supposed to be doing. You don't need to send home a permission slip to put on perfectly appropriate normal programming as part of a school day. Why are you sending home a permission slip to participate in some type of religious assembly? Obviously that poses a problem. At least parents have the benefit of notice at that point. But I think it is good for parents to have this dialogue with either at the school district level or with at the school level, just highlighting it, because it becomes too late. And actually, once it's too late, I've seen this happen where there was a religious group. Their actual name was I'm trying to think of. You Can Run But You Cannot Hide, or something like that.
Yeah, I remember
and they
that
put
one.
on programming in I think it was Dunkerton, Iowa, and it went really badly. The assembly students and teachers were walking out because of some things they were saying. Anti-LGBT statements, basically statements about young girls that were different than statements they're giving to boys about how they have to be pure. This was a problem. The community freaked out, and the principal or the superintendent had to hold kind of a town hall for people to decompress from it. Agreed that they weren't going to come back, and it was kind of a problem for the community. And so I think parents are doing a service to the school if they approach them ahead of time and just kind of ask, hey, I know these groups are out there, do I have your assurance that that's not going to happen at my kid's school? It's not a bad idea, because sometimes it's too late, and if it goes bad not just for the students that are there, but the school district then has a problem on their hands to deal with.
Right. And being an active parent is really a necessity when this stuff is happening. I know from my 6-year-old, it is really hard to figure out what happened to him during the school day. And even some of the student complainants that we talk to on a regular basis, sometimes it's really hard when they're really young. They'll say, oh, somebody came in and talked about Jesus today, and when the parents press, it's harder to figure out exactly what happened. So going to the schools and being more proactive and asking would be helpful. One of our activists, Justin Scott, had some really helpful comments. I'll just read them. I'd be curious to see how many schools that have had hosted groups like the Todd Becker Foundation did any type of promotion in school newsletters ahead of time. Watching school newsletters and school calendars on a local level would be very helpful in staying ahead of these events. And I think that's good advice for parents, just being able to look at that stuff and knowing what's happening in your kid's school.
And I know Justin being, I know that he lives in Iowa, I deal with some of the complaints there. One thing that you should be aware of some of the groups is that they do try to fly under the radar. So if you right now tried to figure out where the Todd Becker Foundation is going, we know next week they're going to be in Nebraska. They won't say what school district they're going to. So some of these groups do try to keep it on the down low until maybe the day before or the day of there's an announcement about the assembly. So I think that's a great idea, because typically schools will say, hey, here's our schedule for the next month, and this is when we're going to have an assembly. But with some groups, they may, the organizations themselves are kind of coy about where they're going.
Right.
And so it's a problem with some of those groups.
Right. So Jacob Knott asks a good question, because we often write to the superintendent, but what if the superintendent was the one who invited the groups to the school? Does that make it legal?
No, it obviously wouldn't make any, it wouldn't make any difference, but, maybe, and Chris, maybe you can chime in, but we think sometimes, just from the responses we're getting from superintendents, is they're not typically involved in the decision-making related to these assemblies, and so it seems that it's more at the principal level.
Yeah, it definitely is, or even, a lot of the Todd Becker ones have happened in the past, but of the calls we've been getting from superintendents, it's sort of like I don't know what you're talking about, this would never be allowed here, but even amongst ones where it has happened, because they sort of, in the same way that the Gideons target principals and teachers, they go low level typically, so that they can, a principal deciding to let them in may not ever get to the superintendent, they may not ever know. In a case where it is a superintendent, it's harder, because there is no person to go to. Like if it's a principal, we can write to the superintendent, who may not know, and then they can address that. If the superintendent themselves is allowing the violation, then we just have to write to the superintendent and explain to them what the law is and that they're violating it.
Or the Board of Education.
The Board of Education in some cases can weigh in.
Right. Well, so here's another question, also from Dan. Does FFRF offer a printable, pre-written letter that we as parents can download and send to our children's schools to be proactive and inform them of violations?
Well, we have pretty extensive FAQs on a number of these topics. Unfortunately, the area that we work in is Establishment Clause, is it can be fact-specific. So it kind of does depend, when is the event taking place, what exactly is going on. We do have on our website, ffrf.org, you can submit a question or complaint. So you will get a response from our intake attorney or one of our attorneys looking at that. If you have a question, hey, how is this a violation, or how can I deal with this? But we don't have, because a lot of the situations are context specific, it's hard to say, here's a letter that you can just send to your school on this particular topic. But we certainly, on your behalf, and this also helps parents because they don't have to be now known to the school as a troublemaker atheist family, we can send a letter on their behalf too. So that also gives them a little bit more of anonymity, so they're not known as being complaining about a particular violation. I think that does help to some extent in making sure that their child can still go through the school without pushback by staff or other students.
Right, and thank you for bringing up our FAQ library. It is pretty extensive, and there's a lot of really good information on there that will help parents figure out what's legal and what's not in their schools. So it is December, so of course we're getting holiday questions and complaints. So this is not specific to our topic, but it has happened where we've had assemblies come in and they do holiday-themed things or something like that. So Marie asks, can schools play Christmas music that specifically and only mentions Jesus or God?
Yeah, this is one where I would say it's worth looking at the FAQ on religious music in schools, because it kind of goes both ways in the sense that it's understandable that parents are upset about overtly religious music. From a legal perspective, the courts have allowed, to some extent, religious songs in connection with a larger secular program. So I would say it's a problem for this school if they're only singing songs about Jesus' birth, and that's it, and that's the extent of the religious or the music that students are getting, or the songs that they're practicing. Most schools, at least, are incorporating a lot of other secular music, and it may be holiday related. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, or songs about Santa. Things that are related to Christmas, but not necessarily about, the biblical narrative. So, unfortunately, this is one where legally we have a hard time pushing schools to completely stop. But I think parents should be vocal about what's appropriate in an increasingly pluralistic schools. There are students, roughly a third of them now are unaffiliated religiously. You have Jewish students, Muslim students. I think schools are still stuck 20 years ago thinking, hey, everybody, the same demographics are present today as were then. It's like there's a lot more people in this country who aren't Christian, so maybe if they do a December program, it should be more inclusive. And I think parents, by all means, should talk to the music teacher, talk to the school about it. From a legal perspective, it can be hard. I mean, it can be hard. We'd have to look at exactly the makeup and what they're doing. So I would say it's probably better for parents to talk about it rather than to treat it as purely a legal issue.
Right. Well, and this kind of brings it back to B-Shock from the beginning of our program today. He was a Christian rapper, and he went and put on an assembly that had Christian rap, and that was illegal, and they were taken to task on that. So that's it for today. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week for another installment of FFRF's Ask an Atheist.